And when that picture was published and we got our weekly copy of Jet magazine, she gathered us all around in the house, in the kitchen. I'll never forget this moment. And she explained to us what happened to Emmett Till. And she said, this is the reason why I would not allow my boys to be raised in the South. This is the reason why I'm picking you up. My father didn't come. She left my father and brought us to Chicago. And she showed us that picture. And it's created an indelible imprint on my brain and my spirit. It's the reason why I knew what I knew, because it made me conscious of the risk, the vagaries, the trepidations of being a black man in America. And it really has kind of shaped my future. I am just so more than words can express. I am just so delighted that finally, after over 200 tries in the Congress, finally after former Congressman Leonidas Dwyer from Indiana sponsored legislation in 1902, and it passed the House, but it failed in the Senate. After 200 tries, attempts, we're finally today poised to pass the Emmett Till Anti-lynching Act in the House today, and we stand on the assurance of Senate sponsors, and then that bill is going to be brought up in the Senate before the end of the week, and then it will pass the Senate. The language will pass the Senate because that's the language that we have adopted here in the House, and it already have passed the Senate previously. It's got 153 co-sponsors in the House. And I certainly want to congratulate our leadership, Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, and my good friend.
We're the majority. Majority Leader.
Majority.
Right?
I said Majority Leader. I said Majority Leader. Yeah, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, and my wonderful colleague and good friend, my political soulmate, Congresswoman Karen Bass, for all their help in passing this bill. And so without any further comments from me, I'm going to introduce right now Congressman Steny Hoyer, and then Congressman Jerry Nadler.
Well, thank you very much. Bobby Rush and I are close and dear friends and have been for many, many years. Karen, I was at an event some 2 years ago, and a guy named Joe Madison, who has a radio program, said, "Why can't you guys pass the anti-lynching bill?" And I didn't have an answer. And shortly thereafter, I came last year and talked to the chairman of the CBC. And I talked to Bobby, who had a bill. Mm-hmm. I talked to Karen. I said, "Karen, why can't we pass an anti-lynching bill?" I didn't have an answer. Lynching is a blot on the history of America. But the even greater blot is the silence that for too long maintained in the context of what people knew was happening. Emmett Till was murdered on August 28, 1955, just 8 years before the March on Washington. And as Congressman Rush has said, his brutal, vicious murder was, of course, a crime. But it was not perceived, or it was perceived as, but not defined as, not just against Emmett Till, but against a whole race of people. That's what a hate crime is. Motivated by the dehumanization of others, so that treating them in whatever way you wanted to treat them was justifiable. The fact of the matter is there was a trial. They knew who killed him. It was the husband of a woman who Emmett Till from Chicago had walked by, and they said he did this, that, and the other, until years later, the woman said, no, that did not happen. This bill is too late in coming, but it is never too late to do the right thing. We'll take the long overdue action of designating lynching as a federal hate crime. I am proud to bring this bill to the floor. Karen, thank you so much for the work that you did to make sure that we had an agreement, came to a consensus, and got this bill in a place. And Bobby Rush, thank you for so long sponsoring this bill, telling that story that you just told, which ought to compel all of us to act. For generations, African Americans and other minorities were terrorized by lynchings, and their memory and symbolism are still used today to intimidate and frighten. That's what these were about. To terrorize others so that they would not seek redress of grievances. You know, that's in the Constitution. But this was intimidation. Lynching means the premeditated, extrajudicial killing by a mob or group of people in order to instill fear. That's its definition if you go to the dictionary. Today, we'll send a strong message that such actions have no place in the United States of America. It is fitting that we are naming this bill in memory of Emmett Till, a young man of 14 years of age who was visiting his family in Mississippi. I've been to the church. Bobby, I don't know whether you were with us on that particular trip, but John Lewis and the faith and politics, I've been to the church where Emmett Till's family went to church, not too far from where he was murdered and then thrown into the Tallahatchie River. There was a trial about 2 weeks later. And of course, an all-white jury found the two defendants not guilty. Emmett Till's mom, as Bobby Rush has pointed out, had the courage to shake America and say, look, this is what hate does. Martin Luther King said, don't be so worried about the words of your opponents as by the silence of your friends. We're not going to be silent today. Today it is a powerful reminder of the consequences of hate and racism. Jerry Nadler, thank you for your leadership in working to get this bill in a place where we could bring it to the floor and pass today and pass in the Senate, we hope, by the end of the week. The House will pass this bill. I want to thank Senator Booker and Harris for their hard work on the issue in the Senate as well. Let us mark Black History Month, not only with our observances and with action to correct a historic injustice, but also to send a strong message against hate. And now I want to yield to my dear friend, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler from the state of New York. Jerry?
Thank you, Steny. I am very proud to be joining my colleagues today in support of H.R. 35, the Emmett Till Anti-lynching Act. This is long overdue legislation that would correct a historical injustice by finally specifying lynching as a crime under federal law. And by the way, lynchings, alleged crimes, sometimes Emmett Till's supposed crime for which he was lynched was that he looked crosswise at a white woman. That's a crime. Of course, an all-white jury acquitted him. That was part of the system of lynchings. But lynchings were not simply hate crimes. They were part of a very deliberate policy to destroy the civil rights and civil liberties of an entire population, the black population of this country. They were started by the Ku Klux Klan right after the Civil War as a deliberate strategy to terrorize black people into not voting, into not raising their heads, and it succeeded for a long time. And black people fought it, but with no allies. The country ignored it. But it was from the 1870s up until at least the 1950s, the basic strategy, a very deliberate strategy of terrorism. It's not just terrorizing individuals. It was a very conscious strategy of using terrorism to destroy the rights of a very large fraction of the American people. And it was very successful. It was the heroism, but it took many years of black people with the NAACP and everything else, fought every step of the way to defeat that terrorism. But it was a sustained terror campaign, not just individuals. And that's why the white juries always acquitted. That's why the sheriffs didn't charge, because it was part of a deliberate strategy pursued by probably 13 or 14 states, lots of localities, and the entire region of the country, and by many others, obviously, but certainly as a sustained strategy there. It was finally defeated. But we have put the final nail in the coffin, the final recognition of what it was, what lynchings, which is still happen occasionally, are, and that's why this bill. The first federal anti-lynching legislation was introduced in 1900, almost 120 years ago, by Congressman George Henry White, who was the only African-American member of Congress at the time. Anti-lynching bills were routinely defeated in the House and the Senate for until quite recently, in fact. This bill is the last that which should be necessary to eliminate the scourge, to educate people about it, and to make sure it never happens again.
Karen Bass, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Good
And the former Speaker of the California Assembly. I like to always mention that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just begin by saying that Emmett Till has a marker, a memorial to him that is constantly vandalized. And the last time it was vandalized was just a couple of months ago. And they have finally installed cameras so that they could see people who were vandalizing it. So today the House will pass the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act and designate lynching as a hate crime under federal law. I am proud of House leadership and Representative Rush, Senator Harris, Booker, our chairman, for their leadership. But I do have to say that we must admit it is a bit of a travesty that it has taken 120 years for the U.S. government to address this crime. In fact, the first bill to outlaw lynching was introduced in 1900. Make no mistake, lynching is terrorism. It is terrorism directed at African Americans, and lynching really, although it was started in a different form by the Ku Klux Klan, as our chairman described, for the 256 years of enslavement, lynching was used to terrorize the enslaved from rebelling. And frankly, even today, periodically you hear news stories of nooses being left on college campuses, worker locker rooms, to threaten and terrorize African Americans. A vicious reminder that the past is never that far away. And in fact, the last known victim of lynching was just 25 years ago. And for the first time in history, the perpetrator was convicted and executed. It is important to hear this history. It's an awful part of our history, and law enforcement officers, average citizens, elected officials, and other leaders actively participated in these savage acts. This form of terrorism was used to kill black people and terrorize and terrify those who were not murdered into understanding that they were not considered as humans. This bill makes a long overdue change to our laws and denounces the terror caused by the thousands of lynchings that have taken place in this country. You should note that there is finally a memorial. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, documents the known history of lynching, because we have to acknowledge there are many people that were lynched. Their stories are not known. But what they do in the museum is they have a monument representing every state and the names of the people that were lynched and the reasons why they were lynched. Not looking in the eye of a white person, not moving to the other side of the street, spitting on the street. And although it is uncomfortable, it is important to hear the facts and the brutality that was inflicted upon African Americans, especially at this time in our history when we see a resurgence of white supremacy. So let me just leave you with this note. But before I say that, I once again want to thank our leadership, our Majority Leader, Representative Rush, for your leadership, our chairman, and our 2 senators. A 1930 editorial in the Raleigh News and Observer noted the elation of the audience witnessing a lynching as follows. Men joked loudly at the sight of the bleeding body. Girls giggled as the flies fed on the blood that dripped from the Negro's nose. Lynchings were brutal, violent, and often savage public spectacles. In the past, these acts of terrorism were advertised in newspapers, memorialized in postcards, and souvenirs were made of the victims' remains. I have nothing else to say.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes, just to be clear, did you say that the Senate is expected to pass this bill again this week? And is President Trump expected to sign it? Is that your understanding?
How
Well,
could he not?
yeah, I think that he's going to sign it. We expect him to sign it. It's supposed to pass by Friday, no later than Friday of this week. This is concluded. The bill is supposed to be passed during Black History Month. Black History Month will conclude on Saturday the 29th, and we expect it to be out of the Senate. Now, whether or not the president is going to sign it before Saturday, we're not certain. I would expect that he would do that.
And if I could just ask a quick follow-up, do any of you know of any perhaps more recent crimes that would actually be covered by this legislation? Given that there's a sort of a broader definition of lynching, I think, than the one that we...
Well, I can't speak to any recent act, but the thought and the threat of lynching is and its current is indicated. You know, it's a part of psychological warfare that's still present in the hearts and the minds and the consciousness of Americans who may not just be black, but may be different sexual orientation, different gender.
Let me just add that there are cases in the South of quote unquote mysterious hangings, different than in the past where they were public spectacles that are under investigation. But the quick answer is we don't know, but I don't rule out that some of those mysterious hangings were lynchings.
Final question? Go ahead.
What's the difference between your bill and the bill that passed the Senate already? And if it's the same bill, why would you send it back to the Senate and run the risk that somebody there puts a hold on it?
Well, our bill has the differences in the title. It has a similar language. It was we worked with the Senate. My staff worked with the Senate staff because my bill was made lynching a hate crime. Their bill made lynching a civil rights violation, and because it's a civil rights violation, it has certain limitations that I really did not, that wasn't in my bill. And so as a compromise in order to get something passed, this was the only thing that we could get passed. I know, and I'm of the opinion that half a loaf is better than a full, than no loaf at all. We decided to just pass the Senate version, and we have been assured by Senator Harris, by Senator Booker, and also through Senator Booker and Harris that Senator Tim Scott is also want to see this passed. And that Leader McConnell has said that he would pass the bill also.
Let me also say something. As you've heard, Emmett Till was a young boy who lived in Chicago. And he went on a summer visitation to some of his family in Mississippi. He came from Bobby Rush's district. And so we think it's very, very significant that Bobby Rush bill that he sponsored, with the compromises made with the Senate, is much more than half a loaf. It is a statement that this country recognizes the hatefulness, the savagery, the dehumanization, and that's what really that Montgomery, Brian Stevenson says. In order to treat a child like that, you have to think of him not as a fellow human being.
Right.
You just have to think of him as an object.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what kind of crime you do. So having this be the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill is, we think, extraordinarily important. Bobby Rush, throughout his lifetime, has been a leader on these issues, and therefore we think it's appropriate that this bill go to the president.
Thank you.
Thank you.